There's probably a phrase you've heard many times. It might be one of those claims about health, about success, about how the world works or how people behave. It doesn't really matter which one. What's interesting isn't whether it's true or false, but the fact that after hearing it so many times, you stopped asking yourself where it came from or why you believe it. It's just there, settled in, part of the landscape of ideas you take for granted. And that, exactly that, is worth exploring, because there's something the mind does almost automatically. When an idea feels familiar, it starts treating it with less resistance. Not because it analysed and approved it, but because it no longer feels like it needs to. Familiarity works like a kind of silent endorsement. It doesn't say, "This idea is correct." It says something more subtle and harder to catch. "I've seen this before, I've processed it, it doesn't feel strange anymore." And in that almost imperceptible shift from unfamiliar to known, something happens that has much wider consequences than it first appears. Psychologists have a name for this: the illusory truth effect. It's one of the most studied phenomena in cognitive psychology, and also one of the most overlooked in everyday life, partly because it operates below the level of conscious attention. The logic is simpler than it sounds, even though its implications run pretty deep. When the brain processes an idea it already knows, it does so with less effort. It doesn't have to build it from scratch or figure out where it fits. There's already a place for it. That ease of processing generates a subtle but real sense of cognitive fluency, and the brain, almost reflexively, tends to read that fluency as a positive signal, as if ease were evidence that something makes sense, that it fits, that it's probably right. The core problem is that ease is not evidence of anything. An idea can become fluent simply because you've encountered it many times, not because it's more solid, more verified, or better supported than before. Repetition doesn't add arguments. It doesn't contribute new data. It doesn't fix flaws or fill logical gaps. But it does change something concrete. It changes the way that idea feels when it shows up in your head. And that difference in feeling carries real weight over what we end up believing. This isn't something that only happens in contexts of deliberate manipulation, or only to people who are especially gullible or poorly educated. It's not a flaw that shows up only in people who can't think critically. It's a feature of how the mind works, and it applies fairly universally, even to people who consider themselves skeptical or well-informed. In experiments where participants are shown a series of statements and later asked to rate their truthfulness, the statements they've seen in previous sessions consistently get higher ratings, even when there's no new reason to believe them more. Even when participants know they shouldn't rely on familiarity as a measure of truth, even when some of them are aware they've seen those statements before. The simple fact of having processed something once is enough to make it feel more plausible the next time around. The mind, to a real degree, can't help it, and that matters enormously because we live in an environment where ideas circulate in ways that have no historical precedent. A phrase can appear in the morning headlines, come up in 3 different conversations throughout the day, show up in content someone shares in the afternoon, and echo through the comments that pile up around it, and then appear again in a news summary before bed. No coordinated intent is required for something to repeat itself enough to become familiar. The mechanism doesn't need a conspiracy or a master plan. It works just as well through advertising, political speeches, headlines that get picked up across dozens of outlets, common wisdom passed around in social conversations, and messages forwarded in group chats without anyone checking whether they're accurate. Every repetition adds up. Every time the brain processes something without friction, that idea settles in a little more comfortably, and over time, comfort becomes hard to tell apart from conviction. What gets repeated doesn't have to be sophisticated to gain psychological weight. A claim can be vague, oversimplified, incomplete, or outright imprecise, and still build momentum the more it shows up in different places. In fact, simpler ideas are often the ones that benefit most from this effect because they're easier to process from the very first encounter. The less cognitive effort an idea demands, the faster it takes hold. A short, direct phrase that doesn't require much reasoning has a structural advantage over a nuanced, layered explanation. Not because it's better or more accurate, but because the brain receives it with less resistance. And that reduced resistance becomes familiarity. And familiarity becomes a feeling of truth. Once an idea is settled in, that sense of certainty can keep growing, even if the evidence supporting it hasn't changed at all. That's probably the most counterintuitive part of this whole mechanism. You don't need new information for something to feel more true. All it takes is more exposure. The idea doesn't improve, it doesn't get deeper, it doesn't gain additional support. It just repeats. And each repetition leaves a slightly deeper impression in the way the brain processes it, until eventually it no longer feels like something you decided to believe. It just feels like something you know. There's another side to this worth looking at separately: the way repetition shapes not just specific claims, but entire interpretive frameworks. In other words, it's not only isolated ideas that gain credibility through repetition, it's also the lenses, the angles, the ways of reading a problem. When a particular way of describing a conflict, a disease, a social group, or an economic situation gets repeated consistently over time, that framing starts to feel like the most natural one, the most obvious one, almost the only one available. Familiarity doesn't just operate on individual facts. It operates on the templates we use to make sense of reality. And that has even deeper consequences because it shapes what questions we think to ask, what explanations feel reasonable, what alternatives we're even capable of considering. Some ideas never get introduced as hypotheses. They arrive as background, as assumed context. And much of that background was formed, without anyone noticing, through repetition. Memory is also affected by this mechanism in ways that aren't always obvious. When one version of an event gets repeated more than others, when a particular narrative about something that happened circulates more widely than competing accounts, that version tends to consolidate itself in the memories of those who encountered it. No direct experience of the event is required. It's enough for a description of that event to have been processed enough times. Repetition can shape not just what we believe about the world in general, but also what we remember about specific situations, including some we lived through personally, but whose meaning was later built and rebuilt through external accounts that kept circulating afterward. All of this also makes things considerably harder when someone tries to correct an idea that's already been repeated too many times. The correction always starts at a disadvantage. It has to go up against an idea that has already gained familiarity, that has already been processed many times over, that already sits comfortably in the minds of those who received it. The correction, by contrast, is new, often more complex, usually more qualified, and it requires more mental effort to absorb. That asymmetry is not a minor detail. It explains why certain mistaken beliefs are so resistant, even when people have access to contradicting information, even when that information is presented clearly and directly. It's not necessarily that people choose to ignore it. It's that the repeated version already has a structural advantage in how the brain receives it. And that advantage doesn't disappear automatically when a rebuttal shows up, because the rebuttal doesn't erase the impression left by all that prior repetition. Recognizing all of this doesn't lead anywhere pessimistic about the human capacity to reason. It leads somewhere more useful, a more honest, more accurate understanding of how the mind actually works. The brain isn't a neutral verification system that evaluates every idea from scratch using consistent criteria. It's a system that conserves effort constantly, that uses shortcuts, that leans on the record of what's familiar to avoid having to process everything as if for the first time. In the vast majority of situations, that's a tremendous advantage. It allows us to function efficiently in a world with far more information than anyone could process with full attention, but it has specific costs, and one of the most significant is that familiarity can be mistaken for truth without anyone deciding it, without anyone noticing, without any bad intention involved. It's simply a consequence of how the system operates. Learning to recognize that mechanism doesn't mean distrusting everything or becoming someone who constantly questions every belief they hold. That would be both exhausting and counterproductive. What it does mean is developing the habit of pausing when something feels very obvious or completely beyond question, to ask where that feeling actually comes from. If something feels true, it's worth taking a moment to ask whether it feels that way because there are solid, verifiable reasons to believe it, or because it's passed through your head enough times to become comfortable. The difference between the two isn't always visible at first. But asking the question, even when the answer isn't immediately clear, changes something in the way you relate to your own certainties. An idea can be repeated 100 times, 1,000 times, and still be exactly as true or as false as it was the first. Repetition doesn't verify, doesn't corroborate, doesn't deepen, doesn't resolve any underlying question. It just makes something feel more natural, more obvious, harder to push back against. And natural is not the same as true, even though they can look so much alike that telling them apart requires an effort the mind, by default, would rather not make.